Science, as a professor of political institution governance and public policies at the Department of Political Science, University of Ibadan, as a fellow of the Pan-African Scientific Research Council and the current head Department of Political Science, University of Ibadan, a former sub-dean of the Faculty of Social Science, a former coordinator of Leadership and Governance Program, a former coordinator of the Center for Sustenance Development, all at the University of Ibadan. And he was a visiting scholar at the Electoral Institute, Independent National Electoral Commission in Abuja, which is the body that coordinates the elections and the decisions of the elections in Nigeria. He has been a visiting fellow at the Trans-Regional Center for Democratic Studies in New York, that's New School University in New York, and now a fellow at the Governance Unit of the Department of Policy Center, this PC, and an independent think tank, as I've said at the beginning, the university and in Ibadan, and at the University of Ibadan. And his influence has extended beyond just the academia when it comes to the leading newspapers in Nigeria, like the Nigerian Tribune since 2008. He has been contributing to public discourse and foreign media and conversations, and has been influential in many organizations. When it comes to publication, he has so many of them, but his recent one was published with O.M. Quadri, which is titled Policies Evaluation in Africa, published by Routledge, and the Handbook 2 of Public Policy in Africa, also published by Routledge Taylor Francis. And those are the two recent ones, but there are numerous ones, journals and other forms of public engagement. Today, it's a privilege that we're having in our midst Professor Emmanuel Remi Ayede. Prof, over to you, your presentation. Thanks. Yeah. We could have clapped, but you know, we're in a virtual space, so people just endorse that with a kind of a thumb or kind of a comments. You're welcome, Prof.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Justin, for that spirited introduction. I will speak to the topic as provided, should academics also be activists? And I will take a historical look at some of the basis and the foundation of all of this discourse. I will begin with the Enlightenment period. I think it's very important for us to go back to that period and what intellectual activities is supposed to lead to. During that period, there was no distinction between the way society is organized, the march of civilization, and the ideas that are coming from the academia. And indeed, it was naturally conceived that the Enlightenment project was the answer to the flourishing of human civilization, and that man will be able to achieve the best possible society for himself. Over the years, as we know, there has been some challenges to that conception of the Enlightenment project, which was built essentially on reason. If we take that and then go on to look at Newman's idea of the role of the intellectual or the university in society, you will see that it follows the idea of the Enlightenment in terms of the role of ideas in social transformation. And that's what it was until the doubt that came to the Enlightenment project with the rise of postmodernism and so on and so forth. But the intellectual crisis came with the experience, especially of the Second World War. After the First World War, then the Second World War, there were questions about how come the world was not ready for the kind of crisis, especially the crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on and so forth, that the intellectual and the universities rather than being a solution to that problem, many intellectuals were in fact implicated in the crisis of the Second World War. And so the debates around the idea of the universities, the rise of global institutions, based on the ideas of previous philosophers, provided the context for the discussion of the role of the intellectual as an activist. So I will just look at it in this way to say that activism sometimes is used to refer to advocacy, which, as I show here, consists essentially of efforts to promote, impede, direct, or intervene in social, political, and other environmental reform in order to transform society for a greater good. This is the context in which the challenge is often presented. So originally, what the point that I've made so far is that there was no distinction between the intellectuals and activism, because it is generally conceived that ideas rule the world, and the Enlightenment project was to transform the world with reason. In other words, science as the tool of such transformation. Now, the debate, of course, also can be viewed from the perspective of the African context. And when we talk about the African context in this manner, we then be looking essentially at the march towards independence. And it came out of a debate around the role of literature in trying to capture the African condition in the face of the writings of Western scholars, anthropologists, novelists, and so on and so forth, in terms of the picture they portray about Africa, and in terms of the role of the intellectual, not only in contesting the prevalent image of Africans in the world of literature and art, but also to begin to look at art as a tool of transformation, of emancipation specifically, as we march towards independence. And the debate was, can the African writer afford to write in order to fulfill the very fundamental goal of literature, which is aesthetics, to suit the emotion, to facilitate the enjoyment of the craft of the writer. And Chinua Achebe, of course, was completely against art for art's sake. Some people thought that the African condition was so there that we cannot afford to do art for art's sake. I mean, one of his interviews, I think at Harvard University, he's made this statement that art for art's sake is just another piece of deodorized dog shit. And then, of course, since then, if you look at the work, whether it's that of Codestra and other emerging African think tanks in the 60s, in fact, from the 50s up to the 70s, there was this consciousness that there should be a definition of the role of the intellectual in social change. And if you also read through the discussion at that time, you'll find that the debate has two dimensions. One, in terms of the role of intellectuals in the policy process, trying to support government, especially in those days of central planning. They are supposed to benefit, universities are supposed to benefit government in terms of development planning. Then the second part is a continuation of the issue that has been raised in line with the literary critics. In terms of social sciences, of science in general, whether science is neutral, whether science is a tool of imperialism and so on and so forth. And one of the very important uptake at that time was Claude Ake's Social Science as Imperialism, what we call a critique of political development. And he has argued that social science, as we have received it from the universities we inherited from the Western world, was designed essentially as a tool of imperialism, and that the way political development is conceived, the theory that we are supposed to passed on to our students such that we sustain some form of colonial mentality. And of course, we know that there's a burgeoning literature since then on post-coloniality. Then we also know that the period through which Africans gained independence also coincided with the Cold War, and there were this ideological struggle between the capitalist world and the socialist world, and there was also this idea of revolution. So following the writings of Marx, which I didn't emphasize in the other global context of the debate, it says philosophers have interpreted the word, what is left is to change it. And it also agrees with the Enlightenment project. The ideas also came to the whole conception of revolution in Africa, the left and the right ideological tendencies. And then, of course, the role of intellectuals in pursuing revolution. Then, in contemporary times, I think since the 1980s and so, there has been another stream of debate around this, not only in Africa, but also globally, about the role of evidence in policy making, and White described it as the evidence revolution, because we originally conceived that science has its method, science has its tradition, science has its processes, and the scientific community is supposed to be different from the policy community, and that the values of the scientific community is not really to change things, but to focus on extending the frontiers of knowledge, seeking the truth, and so on and so forth. And the world of policy is conceived as dealing with everyday problem situation, and they think that the requirements are very different. And of course, there has been concern that there's need to bring these two communities together, because we cannot spend so much money in doing research, in doing science, and we do not benefit from the output of those scientific activities in the development process. And so there's been an evidence revolution within policy studies. And as a policy person, there's a whole transition, even in many societies, in terms of the evaluation of scientific research by university professors. There's all this idea of not just getting the scientific community to engage with the policy community, but in recent times, there have emerged what we call knowledge brokers, who stand between the scientific people who generate knowledge, and then, of course, our policy people who utilize such knowledge. In many institutions of the world today, organizations and governments are putting money into translating scientific research into forms that are accessible to policy people. So it's part of that evidence revolution, because it is believed that once decision making is informed by evidence, we get better decisions, decisions will be better implemented, and so on and so forth. So there's a specifically policy contextual discussion of this issue. Now, if you go to the debate, you'll find that there are still the persistence, the idea that academic research is different from activism. Some people think that academics are driven by curiosity, humility, and honesty, and that their trade is very complex. But activists are eager for change. They want quick facts and ideas that they can use to quickly address issues. And that a typical academic will not have that patience. It's supposed to be neutral. And when you also look at the process of change, they say it's politics laden. And the academic is supposed to be a scientist who is supposed to be objective, and is supposed to represent the values of science. And entering into the activist world, it carries the risk of undermining science, of reducing the trust, public trust in scientific research and so on and so forth. And so they think that an activist, an academic, a scientist should not be an activist, given both the differences in the requirements. Probably that's also why we have this emergence of what I have described as the intermediate position, where knowledge brokers take the responsibility of transmitting scientific research in forms that can be used by activists or those who are policy actors. But in recent time, just like we have experience in the initial global context of violence with threats to our civilization, environmental issues, climate change, and so on and so forth, there is a re-evaluation of the role of the intellectual. They said it is, again, because knowledge is not just about putting what the scientist has done into forms that are used by activists and all of that. There's a whole political activities surrounding the use of knowledge itself, in terms of the manipulation of history, the manipulation of scientific knowledge for uses that are not, that are not particularly very supported by science or intended by the scientific community. Should the scientists just stay back and see, its output being manipulated to cause harm? When people talk about, the war going on in Ethiopia, they talk about the existence of social media and the propaganda activities that goes on. We also can look at what has happened under Trump and so on and so forth. So this has really ignited the debate, not just about academics versus activism, but the responsibility of academics, not in terms of what scientific knowledge is used for. So there should be some kind of responsibility in terms of what the academic does in terms of influencing the community. Now, the point that I would like to make is this, is to say that there are a variety of ways through which activism can be expressed. When we come to the next slide, we will see that it is not, there's really no sharp divide between the world of the academia and the world of the scientist. Because you find that if our role as intellectuals in the classroom, we mold values. There's always this debate about, especially in the political science classes, where you have this partisan orientation in terms of ideology of political parties, the leftists, the rightists, the conservatives, the Republican, the Democrats, and the liberal, and so on and so forth. And the question is, when you are in class, what do you do? Do you advocate your own perspective to your students, or do you present all perspectives to your students? But the bottom line is really that in our understanding of pedagogy, we don't just expect our students to dictate the ideas that we present to them. We expect them to be able to understand them, to evaluate them, to decide for themselves what position they want to take. But we also expect our students to be catalysts of change themselves, because we sort of orientate them into leadership, into the role of leadership of society. So by our engagement with students, we are activists. We are not supposed to just end with just discussing the ideas. We are also expected to promote the right values, the right attitudes, what we call for the sustainability of society. So to that extent, it's difficult to say that you want to separate the function of an activist from that of the academic. Of course, within the classroom activities, the academics is in fact some kind of activist. Then the second one is also that ideas rule the world, as the Enlightenment people have taught us. And when we do research, sometimes we think that our research leads us to some conclusions, and we can be so convinced of our conclusion that we think that we should pursue some of those. And there are all kinds of methodologies, such as the action research, participatory research methodologies, which involves some form of engagement with social change, transformation of society. So through our research, we can be an activist. And to that extent, again, we can say it's difficult to separate the role of the academic from activism, because there's also some kind of research activism that we engage in. And another way is also to look at social movements. You know, we create ideas, whether we are the ones publishing or diffusing the ideas around. One thing is important is that the idea that we generate has influence on societies. And if you want to look at the neoliberal revolution, for instance, we can trace it to the managerial movement, the ideas of some specific writers and how they became influential within government circles, that they transformed into Reaganomics and Thatcherism and so on and so forth. So there's a way in which the ideas of the scholars within the academia stream into the way a society is organized. And to that extent, again, it's difficult to separate activism from academic life. And most social movements involve intellectuals who are the intellectual vanguards. And this is particularly also very important if you read Marxist literature, when we also talk about revolutionary change and the role of intellectuals in that revolutionary process. So Marxians or Leninists will tell us about the intellectual vanguard of the revolution. So there's always some intellectual touch to any form of social change in Nigeria. And then, of course, we can then also look at, we can also, yes. We can also talk about the role of the intellectual in the democratic context. And we can start again afresh the whole argument about, should we be so convinced about our ideas that we want to join political parties? And then, of course, we also talk about policy networks. Should academics who want to influence policy should engage the policy process? And then, of course, there's also the perpetual invitations by the media outlets for us to engage them to clarify issues, to enlighten the public about public problems and so on and so forth, which again takes us back to the responsibility of the intellectual for his society. We can go on and so forth to elaborate on all of this as we try to discuss this issue. But I just want to say that with the writings of Flood, Martin, and Dera, they show very clearly the point that I have made, that by being an academic, you directly engage in some form of activism or the other, because what we do, we produce knowledge to inform progressive social change. We adopt methodologies, sometimes our research are involved in yeah, there was so much noise. I don't know where that was.
So sorry that there's some kind of invaders trying to invade the network, but we're taking care of that, and we can continue the conversation. We handle that from the technical side. And sorry about any anything that.
Guys, how are you?
All right. So please go on, Prof. We are handling that.
Oh, okay, thank you. Because there was an attempt, actually, somebody wanted to talk over my screen.
Yeah, but we are handling that. We are removing them. There's some kind of bug on the server, but we are correcting that very fast.
Okay, thank you. So, and as I said before,
you teach it with me, please.
within the classroom, we are activists. We influence our students. The pedagogy itself, the strategies of teaching and learning, the literature that we do, and the writing we present to our students are also a form of activism. And of course, as institutions, we are also involved in some form of power relations, which can be challenged. One of the common view is really that the university is an elite institution. We have to make concrete efforts to make it relevant, to the rest of society. And as we know, access to universities, university education, brings some opportunities for upward mobility within society. Now, given all of these explanations from the Enlightenment project to the Marxian idea to the policy context and then the African context of the debate, we can still make an argument. Case typology that individuals as academics still reserve the capacity to define their role within society. And Piquet gives us this typology within the policy process to say that some people can decide to be pure scientists, doing their craft, pursuing truth, and doing things as the logic and method of scientific inquiry permits. These people, of course, are not interested in what happens to the knowledge that they generate. They are more interested in ensuring that they extend the frontiers of knowledge and they add new ideas, whether theoretically or otherwise, to the quest for truth. And if anybody is interested in taking up the ideas, let the person take it up. But for them, they just want to speak to the scientific community, contribute to ongoing debates and investigations, and add value to what is available. Normally, we distinguish between pure and applied science. So, it is in this context that we are defining this kind of academics who are just interested in generating knowledge and ideas and are not concerned about translating it into reality. I've seen even political scientists, social scientists taking that position. In fact, I think in one of his visits to Ibadan, Obadari espoused that kind of viewpoint. Then, of course, we have the science arbiter. You must recognize that if you're a scientist and you live within a community and there are problems to be resolved, and sometimes, you might be appointed to a commission, you might be appointed to a committee, you might be invited by government or even the media to provide enlightenment or explanation on what is possible in terms of resolving specific problems. So in that case, Piquet says you'll be playing the role of a scientific arbiter, trying to help them resolve puzzles. You are not the decision maker. You only provide scientific evidence to resolve or clarify some of the issues available. But of course, the third category will be the issue, what he described as the issue advocate, somebody who has done research and has found out that there's a big problem going on, and he thinks as a scientist is responsible for sensitizing the world to that kind of problem. And this kind of scientists you find around the issues of climate change and so on and so forth. It's a big issue. They are not content with sitting in their offices, publishing in scientific journals. They are organizing meetings, connecting with members of Congress, trying to sensitize the world around some of these problems. So the issue advocate is really the real activist in the sense of activism. And when we go on to look at how challenging that can be within the academia, and that also creates the context in which the debate of whether scientists should be activists or not. Because if you in the process of your research, you come across a very important issue that you think calls for urgent attention, and you are sufficiently moved, to address the issue, you say because you are a scientist, you should hold back. And PK says, no, there are issue advocates who will not hold back, who will throw their heart into the ring and participate in the process of decision making. Then, of course, the fourth category is what is described as the honest broker. It says you recognize that the policy process is a political process. It's not just only scientific knowledge that drives the process. There are all kinds of perspectives. There are all kinds of trade-offs in the process of decision making within the public sphere. And it says, as a scientist, your own is to be a honest broker. If you have ideas, put all the perspective before the decision maker. Let them make the choice and take responsibility for the decision that they make. Now, this typology is within the context of engagement of academics with the policy process. So that's the way I think we should conclude the idea of whether a scientist should be an activist or not. I think a scientist should think about all of these possibilities and decide for herself the extent to which he or she can go with activism. But I made one very important point that sometimes at the very minimal level, we are all activists, but that we can go beyond the minimum, and take a decision, depending on our circumstances, depending on how moved we are concerning some specific issues, and depending on also our ideological orientation. If we think that art for art's sake is nonsense, we really need to bring our ideas to bear on society. And so if you decide, for instance, to be an activist, there are certain challenges you face. And a lot of it has been discussed in the literature concerning evidence-informed policy making. The first is ethical dilemmas. You are in the academia, your promotion, your advancement in career does not depend on how you are able to influence the policy process, what change you're able to make within society. Even though, we say that our work is research, teaching, and community service. Most of the time, in fact, until recently in my university here, administrative community service activities, even teaching is not considered when you apply for promotion. And even now, it's a very minimal part, which almost everybody fulfills. It is the research part, the publication part, that matters when you are seeking advancement or promotion within the university. So why would you, for instance, decide to be an activist if you think that you move faster by concentrating on publishing and communicating with the scientific community rather than going the extra mile, to engage in activism? Because again, activism can fail. There's no guarantee that all the efforts, all the media appearances, all the engagement with policy people would amount to anything. And it takes a lot of time and effort and even resources to be able to do so. So you have to decide whether you want to be an activist. And secondly, you also know that by being an activist, you are in the limelight. What it then means is that you can really run into serious trouble. You can run into trouble with government. You can run into trouble with your colleagues in the university. In fact, if you become highly recognized outside, people might think that you are not a real academic. And some people might think that you have become so popular and you attract envy and anger. And if you criticize and your criticism also affects people within the institution, then of course you can be in for real trouble. They can delay your promotion. They can cause all kinds of problems for you. So you also face some of these institutional challenges. Then, of course, there's the expectation of scientific work. So the kind of research that you do to support your activism may not be accepted as for submission for career advancement. because they'll say, it's not scientific. You really need to do serious scientific work. They want you to publish in the best journal, the most highly rated journals in your discipline. So many of those journals will not take activist papers. And so they expect you to write with observing specific scientific procedures and rules. And activism is often archaeologically laden, it's often argumentative, polemical to support one particular position or the other. I mean, that can create real problems for you. Now, there are also political challenges. If you run into trouble, especially in dictatorial regimes in Africa, in the days of the military, lecturers have been picked from the classroom, and put in jail, for the kind of ideas that they teach in class. I remember they used to say that people are teaching what they are not paid to teach, and they are not teaching what they are paid to teach. So those can be real problems that you have to face. So yes, activism comes with the life and activities of an academic, but there are levels of activism, and there are different kinds of activism, activities involved in activism. Each academic will have to decide for him or herself the extent to which he would want to engage in the varieties of activity that we can classify as activism. And to also say that some of these things come with costs, they come with challenges, they even come with ethical dilemmas, which we have to deal with every day. On that note, I would close my discussion.
Thank you very much, Prof. This is detailed, and we appreciate. I think if you appreciate and you can use the icon for the clapping, we have disabled the charts for the meantime, and confirming all the registered people to confirm that only those who are registered are on this platform. Thank you very much, and I can say clap, and we appreciate you, and we'll talk more about some of this that Prof has brought up in his presentation. And he has, first of all, try to look at the distinction between the scientific and community and the policy community, and trying to explore the understanding of what science is and what the practice of intellectuals within the academic community is expected to be. And he discussed that within the context of the history and the origin of even the academic institutions in itself, the universities, and what it has, the role it has played. And then he explored the whole idea of knowledge and the power therein, and how it can be used. And even if effort is being made to prevent the use of knowledge for activist purpose, he make a distinction between different types of activism. And he gave us what we can have as variety of activism. And his submission, if I'm wrong, Prof, you can correct me, but his submission is more or less that there's politics that informed the formation of knowledge. And if politics goes into the creation, the deployment, the expansion, and even the use of knowledge in influencing politics. So what prevents people who are intellectuals from also using this platform to promote their ideas and positions? And he tried to build this position on his understanding of pedagogy. And although he presented some warnings concerning those who want to be involved in what is considered, in quotes, full-fledged activism, which seems to, the people who don't, the government or certain bodies may not be in support of the position the person is promoting. He tried to highlight some of the impediments or problems or challenges they can face. So, and we know that this moves back and forth, but I'll bring a colleague in. Jacob Uzanya is going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. John Rika, and Dr. John Rika will take off from that. So please, Jacob, introduce the next speaker, and then we'll be able to have interaction.
Ladies and gentlemen, pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is an assistant professor at the Loyola University in Maryland, and a postdoctoral associate and lecturer on ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University. He received his PhD in politics from Princeton University and a Master of Arts degree in quantitative method in the social sciences from Columbia University as a recipient of the La Caiza Graduate Fellowship. He studied comparative politics and historical political economy. He has varying research interests, which include political elites, colonial investments and legacies, education, and culture, with a regional focus on Africa. He is a published scholar, and some of his writings have been accepted as at the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Historical Political Economy, Public Choice, the Quarterly Journal of Political Science and Studies in Comparative International Development. Prior to receiving his PhD, he worked as a consultant in Princeton's Innovation for Successful Societies in Mexico and a short-term consultant in poverty reduction and economic management at the World Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the distinguished Dr. Joan Ricard Huguet.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And I can see maybe people are clapping virtually, but Prophet Joan, I think it's over to
Prophet Joan, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Augustine and Jacob, for the introduction. I didn't prepare slides, as I guess I always do in academic talks, because my understanding is, that the two of us would present, Professor Ayede and I, and then there would be more of a discussion. So I figured I'll try to make it somewhat casual and just speak without slides for once. So I'll begin by saying that I'm very glad to have received the invitation. So I want to thank the African Researchers Network and Augustine in particular to invite me to speak in this online webinar. I have to say I wasn't aware of ARN beforehand, but it seems like a great initiative to bring researchers from different fields and living in different countries together. And it seems to me like it has a lot of potential to create the sort of social networks that sometimes academics are not that great at creating, because sometimes we tend to focus a lot on our work, and to facilitate the circulation of information. And as for today's topic, potentially effect social change and perhaps more specifically improve the conditions for higher education in Africa, which is of course a fundamental task because education lies at the root of human development. So when Augustine invited me, I asked him, I remember over LinkedIn, I asked him why, and I thought, could he know that I was an activist back in high school and in my early university years in Catalonia? How could he know, So it turns out he didn't. The explanation was more simple. He saw, I think, one or two of my presentations at the annual meeting of the African Studies Association, and that is what led him to extend the invitation. So I have to say that at first I hesitated whether to accept, because I wasn't convinced that I had anything particularly insightful to add, and because I don't think that I have any, academics may not have any particular authority, and my goal is of course not to discuss or suggest whether people should or should not be activists. Ultimately, I think we all recognize that that's a personal choice. But then I realized that this webinar would give me, one, the opportunity to reflect on a very interesting question, which is the reasons why academics should or should not perhaps be activists, meaning people who are socially and politically engaged to bring about social, economic, political change for the greater social good, as Professor Ayede already defined. And then second, I figured this presentation would give an opportunity also to probably most of us who registered to engage in some introspection, to reflect on our own actions and inactions. And 3, that I might learn from the conversation that I believe will follow our 2 presentations. So I'm very glad to be here, in short. And as you know, most social scientists conduct, at least definitely here where I am based in the US, we conduct what we might label positive scientific research. We focus on trying to explain why things are the way they are, right? And as it turns out, some of my research along these lines on culture and activism focused on Uganda's Makerere University was recently accepted for publication. And I would be more than happy to discuss some of that research and activism if that were of interest to anyone in the audience. But the question that we are debating today, of course, is a normative one. It asks us to consider what our behavior as academics should be, right? Not to explain what it is, what is or isn't. And that is something that the pressures of academic life, at least for PhD students and pre-tenure professors like me, we don't always give it enough time to reflect upon. So I would like to make a few considerations regarding whether academics should be activists. And my reflections, I was thinking, and I realized that they're mostly informed by my time as a student activist in my home country in Catalonia, by now nearly 14 years living in the US, essentially my adult life. And then by the time I have spent in Uganda in the last 10 years now or so, specifically at Makerere University and what I have learned in those 3 countries. So the first point I want to make is that I read the question as, do academics have a special responsibility to be activists? The prompt I received stated, some people believe that it is not ideal for academics to take positions on political issues because they will use the office of trust to brainwash their subjects and drag them along the path they thought was correct. The prompt continued, others believe that academics have the moral duty to use their wealth of knowledge in guiding society towards making valid value judgments when it comes to political issues. So that was the prompt, which I thought it would be useful to read explicitly. And I think it's a very good prompt and a very interesting one. The first distinction I want to make is between the academic as an expert and the academic as an activist. I think that's an important distinction that the prompt might conflate a bit, or is not making that distinction at least. And so the academic as an expert, I think many academics, myself included, think that scholars have a moral, perhaps a social duty to serve as experts, to inform the public on topics which they know perhaps better than most other people, and in doing so, perhaps guide society towards certain public policies that ultimately increase our welfare. I think we have all witnessed the role of professors in epidemiology, professors in public health. During the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, we expect them to use their expertise for the benefit of society. They may get it wrong at times, especially in something like an evolving pandemic on which information is limited. But the idea is that they get it less wrong than a random person, right? Or than a professor in, say, economics or engineering who may know little about medical and public health issues, right? So the first point I want to make then is that it is disingenuous to say that the ability of academics to inform the public is no different than that of the average citizen. And instead, I think it can be greater. And so academics have some responsibility, especially when called upon to try to act as experts in issues that are related to their own field of study, issues that they know well. PhDs, after all, many studies have documented it, have higher levels of intelligence and are better informed than the average person in society, right? And so we have long known that, at least on topics concerning someone's expertise. And so that is one argument, I think, why the academic as an expert is something that perhaps most people can agree upon. So the academic perhaps should be ready to face the public and share whatever insights they might have. But the academic as an expert is different than the academic as an activist, right? As someone that pursues social or political change. And the answer to whether the academic should be an activist, it seems to me, is much less obvious. The first case I want to make, and here I may disagree somewhat with Professor Ayede, is that I think in general academics should not try to be activists inside the classroom. Now, absent, of course, some extraordinary circumstances that require perhaps immediate political action, say a coup, as we have recently seen in West Africa. Perhaps there's conflict about to break out. So there are situations that, extreme situations that may well justify breaking that rule, quote unquote. But I think it's a general rule to distinguish whether the academic is an activist inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And so inside the classroom, I guess my view that academics should perhaps not be activists inside the classroom was something that, not really knowing it then, I came to believe in my freshman year in college when I was doing my undergraduate degree in Barcelona. I had an excellent professor who was teaching us Spanish politics. And it turns out, I later learned that he was very much involved with one of the leftist parties in Catalonia. He had even held some positions of minor responsibility. He was definitely dedicated to progressive politics, in short. But you are unable to tell from his lectures. His lectures were interesting and not politically biased in any particular way. And so, as a political science major, I appreciated that he took the science part of political science seriously, and that he tried to explain the way we behave, why we behave, I mean, the way we do, but he didn't discuss explicitly why we should behave one way or the other, right? He didn't take positions in a normative sense. And that may very well be a pertinent topic of discussion for an ethics class or a political philosophy class, but I think should not be the focus of most courses, even within the social sciences. Having said that, I'm not naive enough to think that ideology is easy to forget for any academic or any professor once you step into the classroom. For instance, whether you teach neoclassical economics or Marxist heterodox economics, you are making a set of assumptions about human behavior, and these assumptions are ideologically tinged. So I'm not trying to argue that science is value neutral. I think that is certainly not the case for most domains of work in the social sciences, and perhaps not even for some of the domains of work in the life sciences. Things concerning, biology and evolution and the like. So I think in many cases, many academics are making a set of assumptions about human behavior that are at least implicitly ideologically motivated. So my point rather is that professors should try, like my freshman professor in freshman year did, they should try and check their own ideological biases when they enter the classroom, so that they are minimized inside the classroom. So, if we agree on that, then in my view, the question is whether academics have a special responsibility, or at least the responsibility to be activists in their life outside of the classroom, be it on campus, in their town or city, nationally or internationally. Now, on the one hand, it may seem presumptuous to think that we have a sort of special responsibility. We are far from the only social group that is well informed. It's common to criticize pundits who may utter platitudes, in TV programs and so on. But there are plenty of well-informed people outside of academia who are very socially and politically active, such as investigative journalists, people in the NGO world, or what we call the third sector, right? So some might argue that we may not have a special responsibility to be activists and to spend some of our time pursuing social change and making public statements and participating in events that aim to move the needle on certain policy subjects like global warming, abortion, you name it, right? But on the other hand, academics, or at least tenured academics, have a level of job security and freedom of political speech that few people enjoy, even in democratic countries. Think about public sector workers like diplomats and high-level civil servants. These are highly qualified people in most countries, be it the US, in Europe, in African countries, right? These are highly qualified people. But typically they need to be careful not to be seen as partisan or to activists, because since they are part of the structure of power, and their role is typically not explicitly political unless they are political appointees in the public sector. So they have to tread very carefully when discussing politics in public. And they are typically not writing op-eds in newspapers and making other such public, social, and political statements. Think about people in the private sector who may worry about the employer retaliating against them if they become activists or too politically involved. Retaliation of that sort shouldn't happen, but of course that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, right? It does happen sometimes, especially in countries where institutions are weaker. So when we compare academics, which are part of the non-profit sector insofar as universities are by and large not for profit, when we compare ourselves, I guess, to the public, to most workers in the public or private sector, we realize that because in part because of our expert knowledge on certain matters, right? It doesn't mean that if you're an academic on topic X, you should talk about Y, Z, and whatnot as if you knew a lot about it, but you may know a lot about particular topics. So given that, and given that job security, especially for tenured professors, is quite high, I think we can make the argument that we have a higher responsibility than average, than most other people probably, to engage in activism and to try to contribute to the greater social good, compared especially to those whose jobs make activism risky. Especially perhaps, I think, those academics in the social sciences, because their work may be directly related to understanding activism, public policy, and to effect change. They may be invited to join certain NGOs, or perhaps to be policy advisors in the local or national government, or when in times of contestation, they may be invited to join the opposition to oppressive governments. So I think these are all worthy and sometimes risky behaviors that should definitely not be dismissed, as some public engagements of the sort are sometimes dismissed by, quote unquote, ivory tower academics. So I think that's the wrong tag. That's isolating academia from society. In fact, some of these should be encouraged to try to increase the social contribution in addition to the intellectual contributions of academics to society. Right? So putting the arguments together, I think there is a reasonable claim to make, and I'll finish with that, a reasonable claim to argue that outside the classrooms, academics are in a very good position to not just act as experts and to try to diffuse information in society, but even to engage in social and political activism. And with that, I'll turn it over to Augustine and Jacob.
Very much, Dr. Joan Rican, and it's interesting to listen to you speaking to the paper, and you started by giving a preamble to what led to the conversation we're having today, and which was your presentation at the ASA conference, and your experience also in Africa, and as well as in the US. And in your presentation, you have been able to make a distinction between the academics as an expert, maybe in the classroom or within the university community, and as an individual with opinion, with freedom, and basic liberty that is accorded to people in the democratic setting. and you tendered a submission that you believe that is not ideal for them to be involved in what we call its activism in the classroom in such a way that they just have to ensure that they check their presupposition biases and ensure that they are not value-laden in their representations of the theories that they are putting forward. But you also recommended how activism can be done out of the classroom and how their opinion can also be voiced out. And this seems to be the central part of your submission. And we really appreciate that. Thanks for your opinion. And then we open the room now for conversation. The security unit has enabled everyone to be able to, those whose registration has been confirmed, to be able to on their cameras and unmute themselves, as well as drop notes in the chat. So we're going to take a few questions, and we know the Prof is also still here. And in our own, the African Researchers Network, as you said, it's not you getting to know about us just this year or so. And we have been in existence for more than a year, and it's interdisciplinary, and we take a look at point of view on various issues, especially something that borders on the academic and research in general. And when we chose this topic, it's something that came out of a conversation we have been having on our WhatsApp group. We have a WhatsApp group, and the whole thing about should academics actually be involved in what we can say the forefront activist, what we can say issues that activists are currently engaged in, which has to bother on race, gender, what we can also talk about race, gender, and police brutality too. And this is not peculiar to a particular society. It's in the US, it's in various African countries, Nigeria, where I'm from, and where Prof is speaking from. And then the question is, you can see from the flyer, people are concerned and they wonder why the academics quiet. And Brother Shabazz, please come in, and I will take off from there. Brother Shabazz, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Doctor.
Yeah, I guess a few things. One, I wanted to note, I think it's important to note that, my worry or concern is that there was no we took the idea of science uncritically, right? So for many years, up until the 60s, in fact, science was wedded to white supremacy, explicitly. I would argue that science is still, biased, despite the pronouncements being neutral and rational and objective, and creating some distance between the observed and the observer. There are still these assumptions that a scientist makes that are, I would argue, that are Eurocentric, as I think our presenters have alluded to also. But yeah, so the first thing is that science itself has always been biased and racist and informed by the perspective of Europeans, and Africans have been marginalized in this science. So I think the first project would be, or an important part of the project would be Africans critically assessing what science means to Africans, and not just swallowing the idea of science that Europeans have given us, and that reflects the history and experiences of Europeans, right? And we haven't done that. Currently we're in a model that wasn't created for us by us. And then secondly, in terms of getting to the question specifically, I think I would ask the question, should African academics, scholars be activists? And then the question would be, I think, be more obvious to me at least. In Nigeria, the life expectancy of an African man is 55 years or something like that. At the top of the scale is Hong Kong, where I think it's 82. And African countries tend to gravitate towards the bottom of that scale, near Nigeria somewhere. I think Uganda, it might be 62 years or something like that. So people are dying, right? And we need all hands on deck, including academics. And as Paul Robeson said, the great Paul Robeson, the Black activist, African-American activist, there is no sheltered rear, right? We need all hands on deck. There is no sheltered rear. We need everybody engaged in transforming Africa. We have to take positions. We have to advocate. We have to change our situation, whether we're in the United States, I'm an African-American in the US, our situation is also dire. Whether you're in Jamaica, wherever you are as a Black person, our situation is dire, and that means that, and urgent. And that means, to my mind, that Africans they have to be engaged. And as far as it being dangerous, of course it's dangerous. You know, we lived under Jim Crow here in the United States for until the 60s. So that's it's a given. You know, people are going to die, but we have to die struggling to change this monstrosity that has been imposed upon us. So the science has to be critically examined and reinterpreted from an African perspective. We need to decolonize our institutions. Secondly, and then lastly, you know, there's just a sense of urgency, given that, you know, what is at stake is our very lives. Africans are dying, and if all of us don't put our hands on deck and solve this problem, we will continue to die. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Shabazz, for your contribution. And the aspect you brought up was something I was also trying to highlight, especially when it has to do with Africa. Prof started with that in his presentation, that the knowledge system, what is considered as the bedrock of knowledge, or what we say the canon, from the books to the syllabus, seems to be an agenda that was made by the Europe or the Western nations, and those knowledge systems seems to be made protected under the canon of objectivity, under the canon of removing emotion and prejudice and other forms of things. And the first shock that will receive as started with Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, when the students first of all felt, we are tired of all these things you are teaching us, and we're tired of all this image around us. And then followed by this whole decolonizing the curriculum, and then the ongoing critical race theory. But there seems to be a kind of this, you know, don't be biased, cover your prejudice. But, you know, I want to ask the speakers, don't you think that the voice that, you know, those who felt they have not been included, and those who felt that the only platform they have is through activism, and the biggest oppression, that the thing they have is included in what they have to pass across and what they have to teach, and they don't have the power. You know, power seems to be at work. So I just want the speakers to just help us to dissect this in the light of, if it is possible, in the light of all this recent activism across the globe, especially in Africa. Prof and Dr. Joan, please, when you have a chance.
Okay, let me respond to that. You see, you know, it's a little bit tricky to claim neutrality within the classroom, and I think the point that Joan has made, we should take it along. The fact that it recognizes that behind every theory, behind every scientific discussion, there are certain basic assumptions, you know, that underscore whatever position we take on any issue. I teach research methods, for instance, and what I teach is research methods in political science. But, you know, I can't just discuss the methods of political science without engaging with the epistemology of it. And naturally, when you discuss epistemology, you have to reflect on the power relations behind science. And standpoint epistemology is a very vital point when you talk about inclusion and exclusion. In terms of, as Sandra Harding would put it, in terms of the setting of or deciding the agenda for research, in terms of what we even consider as constituting scientific research, and also in terms of the focus of research. And that is why the argument is really that the neutrality of science, the objectivity of science is often overstated. And it's important for us to recognize that. For instance, when you are teaching that kind of course in a class situation, you have to address some of those inequalities and power relations. Then for us in Africa, and I think that's very important in relating to what the last speaker talked about. You see, we have a burden in terms of commitment to our society, in terms of our understanding of the interplay of forces within our society. And so when you teach in a class, you don't just look at the content, the knowledge content. You're also concerned about skills, but more importantly, also concerned about attitudes. Yes, we have adults, we say they are young adults in the university, but we know that we have serious problem that has to relate with colonial mentality, where because of the mesmerization of our young people, their exposure to the internet, their exposure to Western ways of life and all of that, they have some kind of loss of self-confidence. And they think that anything from Africa is not good enough. You really have to travel out in order to get something good. And you have to carry the burden that the West is not going to develop Africa. Africa has to be developed by citizens. So in teaching, you have to be conscious of the need to bring that into the consciousness of your student. You know, we have these dilemmas in Africa. We have these problems in Africa. The way to deal with it is to, hone your skill purposefully, confidently, effectively, so you'll be able to represent the voice of Africa within the scientific community. But even much more important than that, you take responsibility for the growth and development, and also for the interests of Africa in the Community of Nations. So this is the extent to which I perceive the idea of activism within the classroom. So it's not necessarily in terms of national politics. You are PDP, somebody is APC, but it's much, much more broader than that, and much more complex. And that's why the scientific engagement of the scholar is really a complex activity in which circumstances, and that's why I went to the debate about art for art's sake, and then of course the debate of this issue within the policy process, because that's where we find ourselves, what we describe as the African condition, and our higher institution must be made to respond to those needs. Currently, as they are, they don't. We are too diverse from the scheme of things. We are diverse from government, and then we have to compete, for instance, with the World Bank and the IMF in terms of policy decision making within our own society. So we really do face some of those challenges, whereby in looking at the whole question of whether academics should be activists, it will not be the same thing, the same understanding of that question if somebody were, for instance, an American within the American society.
Thanks, Prof. Dr. Joan, please.
Yeah, I guess I'll be brief, because I think a lot of the points that Professor Ayede made are spot on. I guess I just so there's there are important problems of Eurocentrism to this day, and I've seen those in Africa, sure, but even in North America, where there's sometimes a deference to European ways of life and the like. I think that is very true. It's also true that the scientific method is something that has been used by many peoples around the world, right? It just so happened that in recent centuries, major kind of technological and or medical advances, say, most came from Europe, but of course North Africa and the Middle East, they used the scientific method extensively 1,000 years ago and before then. So the scientific method per se, it's important to emphasize that it's not race specific. A lot of the things that have come with it, and there's this veneer of objectivity that is attributed to certain scientific findings, that there are a lot of possible problems there. But it's important to make that distinction, because the last thing we want for the development of any country, American, African, or whatever, is to reject the scientific method just because of where it was most developed in recent centuries, right? That's, of course, shooting yourself in the foot and hindering development.
Thank you very much.
I think I agree with Joan. We are not contesting the scientific method. I think it's important because, even in our classroom, we some people who are not mathematically inclined, who reject quantitative studies and all of that. But I make it very clear that if you want to be able to represent the voice of Africa, for instance, you must be able to understand and use the tool of science. You can't contest the scientific method without having the competency, that is required to be able to do so. And I think that's a bottom line. We can't say because we think that there's some bias in terms of setting the agenda for scientific research, in terms of what scientific knowledge has been used for. Therefore, we want to reject science completely. That will be shooting ourselves in the foot. So yes, I agree with you completely. And it's important for us to drive home that point, that it's our responsibilities as scholars in Africa to be very, very good, in using, understanding and using the tools of science. And in fact, that's the only way we can position ourselves to be able to make a voice in the scientific community.
Thank you very much, Prof. We have Afiz. Afiz, you can unmute yourself. We have enabled the chat room. We know that everywhere is cleared now, so we have enabled the chat room, but you can unmute yourself, Afiz Sufianu, to address your comments or questions to our guest speakers. Afiz, are you still there? While we're waiting for Afiz, Dr. Martins, Maria Martins, drop a comment that the call for distance and objectivity is a mechanism to keep the system going as it is. White scholars of the African Studies Association in the US made this argument that Black Americans cannot be objective in the study of Africa, so they should never inhabit leadership roles in the association or be taken serious as scholars of Africa. This argument that academics should not be political also operates in the same subversive way if shame and silencing tactics are tied against things that create inequality, then the system will continue as it is. And there's a long comment from Dr. Maria Martins. Hafiz, you can speak.
Yes.
Why our speakers can incorporate the comments or their response to that comment to the response. Hafiz, please go ahead, please.
All right, thank you so much. The coordinator as well as the presenter, I really appreciate from the perspective where Joan is trying to argue from that we should try to separate activities from academic, but my point of view is that just as Shabazz has already cleared the air for us, that it may be very difficult for us here in Africa to separate activists from the academic field. For instance, in Nigeria, the government forced the academia to be activists in the times of trying to fight for their rights in the school arena, in the sense that the academia has to go on strike before government can listen to them. So these are the things that warrant an academia to be an activist. Otherwise, they will not be able to fight for their rights or their privilege that's supposed to receive from the government. So these are one of the things that we must know in Africa perspective. Although we may not be able to generalize it, but in that aspect, we cannot do without an academia being an activist. Otherwise, they may not be able to claim their privileges and rights from the government, because the only language that the government understands is a kind of reaction, just as Isaac Newton pointed out that for every action, there must be an equal opposite reaction. So for this reason, shows that Nigerian academia as well as African academia generally, they ought to be an activist because they have all this ideology. And if they are not intervened in the situation how the government operates or run the state, everything may turn out to be chaos and nasty. And secondly, which I must point out, is that the European colonizer has turned most of African scholars to activists because there is no way they were able to fight for the independence except a kind of reaction, opposite reaction towards the colonizers. So these are the 2 points that differentiate Africa scholars from the global scholars. So these are the 2 summits that I have. That my point of view is that Africa academia ought to be an activist based on these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afeez Sofiano. And your points, if I know that our speakers are going to address that, but if you look at the part of what the speaker said about the varieties of activism, and which was split out and making the difference between classroom activism and as well as other social movements or partisan or other forms of fighting for your right and speaking the truth. And you brought in the case of, you use Nigeria as a case study to expatiate your point about the kind of what we can say antithesis between the government and the people in the academia, in which they have to go on strike in order to get their rights. Or the point also made by Dr. Maria with regards to the Black academia, or either people from Africa or who are identified as Black in the global scope, needs to do certain things to be able to have their voice heard, ask for decolonizing the curriculum. She used the example of an organization saying that's the medium, but we're going to get the speakers to address this. Let's take Dr. Muyiwa Adigun. Please go ahead, unmute yourself, and if you like, you can on your camera and address your concerns. All this will be addressed by our speakers after Adigun. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm actually looking at the issue from the perspective of law.
Okay.
Because that is my own academic field. I think without being exhaustive, there are about 3 factors that will actually determine whether an academic is going to be an activist or not. The first one may relate to the nature of the field itself. I'll give an example. For example, if you are teaching law of contracts, what you're likely to teach in the first semester may relate to when a contract is created. For example, offer and acceptance. At what point can you say there is a contract between 2 parties? Then second semester, what you're likely to teach is, okay, there's a breach of contract. What are the remedies available? Under what circumstance will you say there is a breach? You may not necessarily have to be ideological in this respect. Yes. And I think to a large extent, courses related to business law, you may not necessarily have to be ideological. Yes. Now, compare with constitutional law, for example. You may be ideological because the nature of constitutional law itself. First, constitutional legal rules are often broad. Yes. And they admit of opposing views. In fact, if you look at the bench, you have instances where you can say conservative judges or progressive judges. In fact, in the United States, some judges are appointed as conservatives. Some are appointed as progressives. And of course, some are even from the academia and they are posted to the bench. So the nature of the course or the field in law may determine. Then secondly, it may have to do with an individual personality as well. For example, take a constitutional as the first example in contradiction to business law. you discover that the very fact that you are teaching constitutional law as well does not necessarily mean you must be an activist. There are people who have taught constitutional law and they are not activists. So it doesn't necessarily follow that, well, the nature of the cause alone, the individual personality may also determine. And then the third one is that although this one also relates to the nature of the field of study, but essentially you probably don't have any choice. I'll give an example: international law. If you are teaching international law from an African perspective, I don't see the reason why you won't go into TWIL, third world approaches to international law. Yes, that may not be taught in a Western country, but I don't think you will want to teach international law in an African university without talking about TWIL, third world approaches to international. What is our own approach to it? So from the perspective of law now, I think it may relate to a number of factors: the individual personality, the nature of the field itself. And of course, in an instance where you are just helpless, there is no way you could have taught it without being ideological. For example, you are teaching critical race theory. Yes, it essentially is ideological. The nature of that discipline itself is ideological. It is not about I want to choose to be ideological or not. You can't choose to be not to be ideological. So that's just my opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adigun, and for your perspective on law. I think I should invite the Hafiz has raised his concern, Dr. Maria Martins too, and now we have Dr. Adigun too. So I think the speakers have some response. Maybe it could be from African point of view, it could be from American point of view, and it could also be from experience across various nations. So please, any of the speaker can jump into this conversation. Prof. Joan and Professor Emmanuel, please feel free to respond to these issues raised by this three participants.
Okay. Yeah, I think the point that Amuyiwa made is very interesting. I think it's sort of explain the practical challenges that we face in the classroom. Yeah, it's quite right in terms of the orientation. I think that there are some burden that we carry as a result of our standpoint, our location in the scheme of things. And that's why I made reference to the whole idea of standpoint epistemology. Now, if you also look at his own point of departure, which explanation, which it talks about critical race theory. I mean, critical theory generally is ideological. And I know that there are lots of some political scientists who will not go there. I mean, you can go through a political science 4 years program and not a counter-critical theory. Then secondly, there's also these two traditions in political science. Again, I like to go to the research method because it's actually the means through which we initiate students into the discipline, into the knowledge production process of our discipline. And it's important when we discuss these issues relating to activism, that in doing that, we must recognize that there are different traditions in research method. In fact, I've read some political science research methods textbooks that start with the very idea that the goal of research is generalization. And any form of research that does not lead to generalization is not worth the effort. And of course, this represents a particular perspective in the social sciences. Now, if you come from that perspective, you are likely to overlook other perspectives in the social sciences. And then you teach, of course, the methods of science, which is the positivist perspective. But we know that that's not the only tradition, and it will also be some kind of activism. If you focus on that, it means that you are privileging certain things against some methodology over and above other methodology. And that's another form of activism that I talked about when I talk about pedagogy. If you then, for instance, a non-foundationalist perspective, then you'll be doing a better justice to it than if you just focus on your preferences. And that's why I also, in my last intervention, talked about the need for us to be competent in both traditions, in trying to take up our responsibilities as scientists operating from the African continent. So yes, to an extent, we can talk about the objectivity and neutrality of science, but we need to also know that the objectivity can be overstated and the neutrality can be overstated. And more importantly, in terms of what Hafiz was talking about, there's a sense in which transformation is not outside the classroom. And if you look at the American educational system, the whole concept of pedagogy is about transformation. And if you look at pedagogy from that perspective, then you know that there's something inherently about values, within the classroom. That's not to say that I'm suggesting that you should be openly partisan. For instance, you want to canvass for the position of PDP in class, or you want to canvass for the position of APC. It's not at that level political partisanship that I'm talking about. I'm actually talking in terms of the various school of thought in the disciplines. And that's why when I was also talking about the specific challenges of Africa, I also mentioned the whole idea of the contestation of knowledge forms. I mean, the policy arena is a marketplace of ideas, and there are different perspectives. Until the occurrence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the neoliberal tradition, policy orientation, was very dominant. But in the face of COVID, even the West abandoned some of those massive intervention. They were funding the production of vaccine and all of that. So the whole idea of market theology is not something that we can take for granted anymore. Like it no longer enjoys the kind of dominance that it has in the 80s and 90s, and we know the consequences of the imposition of those ideas on African countries. So that's why we must recognize the fact that even ideas are complex, they are perpetually competing, for spaces within the policy-making arena. And therefore, we cannot just treat your idea of being activist as something that we have 100% control over, that is 100% liberty to choose whether we want to be an activist or not. Sometimes our circumstances necessitate our jumping into the ring and making some of those interventions. Again, within the context in which we are talking about, there's even context between self-interest and common good. And it's important for us to also put that on the table as part of the dilemmas that we face within the African continent.
Thank you very much. Prof. John.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, and I've been looking at the chat as well. And I guess just to touch on some of the points discussed, I think, and perhaps to follow on my on my previous point as well, I think Jacob's comment is spot on, where he says that the key is not the scientific method per se, but what some people try to construe as reality, right? And to present social science as objective, when, by definition, a lot of what you do it as a subject, right? So there's a subjective element, even if the scientific method per se, in the abstract sense, is objective. I think it's important also to note that, that both of these things are true, right? And so that a lot of economic progress depends, depends on, on the level of education, and of course, science is at the center of that. So, to engage with one of the other comments, I think, which was from Brother Shabazz, it's true that in the last few centuries, the scientific community has been mostly white, but of course that was not always true, right? Before that, it was for a time mostly Middle Eastern and North African, and it's not that obvious that scientific progress is now mostly a Western thing, insofar as if you look at research and patents and innovation and so on, China and then South Korea and Japan are punching really strong. So now essentially, just as it is the case for the largest economies, of course, China and the US, it is also the case that science, you have a set of universities in the West and increasingly a set of universities in East Asia that are producing formidable research that was not true 50 years ago, right? So I think it's important, whatever country we come from, and in my case, Catalonia, we're far from at the forefront of innovative academic research in the sciences or in the social science to push for it. And I wanted to finish with one example. So one of my advisors in graduate school was Leonard Wanchekon, a Beninese political economist who first was in Canada and was an activist, by the way, already in college in Benin against the dictatorship after independence. And so he's first and foremost, I guess, a scholar, but he was an activist then, and now he engages in a different type of activism, whereby he founded the African School of Economics to train the next generation of African political economists, not just Western Africans, but he hopes African more generally. And I think that's a terrific model, and one that, on the one, it's a private university, and I think public universities should be at the center of any country, really. And I'm sure Professor Ayede agrees, given that he teaches at the University of Ibadan. But that's not to say that there's no place for a dynamic private university like the one that Professor Wanchekon has established in Cotonou. And of course, it's a university that at the same time places the African generation of knowledge at the center, while of course embracing the social sciences and the scientific method. So I think there are wonderful examples to move forward. So I hope that was not too much of rambling.
Thank you very much, Professor Joan. And part of the contributions that was made, especially by Afiz and Dr. Martins, has to do with a question or an assumption that, is sort of, I can phrase it this way, that are all activism directed against the government? Because there's this assumption that when, and is activism even tied towards protest, and agitating towards a kind of a policy change? And does it mean that the government hates activism? And because part of the questions that are raised, that people are forced to become activists, like you use the case of Nigeria, in which you don't have any option. Dr. Maria Martins' case also brought the case in which the Blacks or Africans, people of African descent, are already assumed to be activists, even within the African based organization or academic organizations, or they won't be objective. But the question is activism actually directed towards the government? And activist or ideologies that fuel activism, are they coming from the humanities? Because Dr. Adigun made mention of this dynamics, and could that really affect the funds? Or people say a lot of assumptions that there are efforts being made towards reducing funds for the humanities because they are saying things that are controversial or affecting government, or things like critical race theory and other forms. So maybe you can help us to address some of these presuppositions about activism, as well as the contrast between the government and all forms of activism. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would say that our discussion so far does not suggest that activism is about we and the government. We have sort of defined activism in a very broad sense, And I'm also happy that Joan talked about Wichekron from Benin. He's actually the founder of the African Scientific Council, for which I've had the opportunity to work with him on a number of programs. Yeah, I think that the activism is more broadly defined, and it relates to conflicting interests in terms of knowledge production. It also relates to transformation more broadly, and the transformation beyond politics, because we talk about social transformation in a very broad sense. And we're also talking about activism in terms of academic responsibility to society, not just to government or against government. We also talk in terms of specific issues, and we also talk of activism in terms of intergenerational responsibilities. So it's much more broader than just government. And I think the more important issues we have actually raised is activism in relationship to knowledge, in relationship to ideas, because that's where academic activities revolves around. So it's not, and we are looking at it from the power relations located within the context of knowledge production and knowledge diffusion. And I think that's our discussion of the idea of activism and academics, not necessarily in terms of government and opposition. I think it's important for us to make that distinction. It's not about government and opposition. It's about issues and issues around change and transformation towards achieving a better society. And then the actors that we have also engaged, we have talked not just about government, we have also talked about the non-governmental sector. We have talked about academics as individuals, and we have also talked about academics in institutions. And we also talk about a transnational engagement, looking at academic as a global activity. So I think it's important for us to understand it in this broader context.
John, please, do you want to comment?
I don't know that I have anything specific to add, you know, as far as the government is concerned. Yeah, that really depends, you know. Sometimes being activist means going directly against your government. That's the case, especially when the government is not responsive to popular demands. And in more democratic governments, sometimes activism means shifting the government slightly towards your preferred policy positions. So, you know, I agree with what has been said. It's quite broad, and activism concerns trying to affect social political change, but it can come, of course, it can come from, you know, from the left, from the right? So, I think it's best to let other people speak.
Yeah, but is it really true, Prof. Joan, that the ideology that fueled activism comes more from the humanities, and that also informs underfunding of research in the humanities? You know, is it really true? That's one of the concern raised.
Yeah, thanks for, I forgot. Yeah, you mentioned that. The short answer is, anecdotally, this may be the case, but I don't have any hard data to back this up in any particular country, whether it's, you know, I don't know, the countries I spent some time in, be it the US or Catalonia or Uganda. So that may be the case, but I don't know for a fact. I think it's somewhat natural that people whose research concerns the social world more directly might have more of an interest in shaping it than than someone studying pure mathematics. But that's not always, you know, that's not always the case. I was, you know, we were just mentioning Leonard Wanchagon, and he studied mathematics, right? So there are plenty of exceptions, assuming that on average it is the case that activists come more from the humanities. I think we would need to collect some data, and maybe someone has done it, but I just don't know the data off the top of my head. So.
Thank you. And Dr. Adigun want to come in. I have a question, because this question came from what we call it from our chat room, ARN chat room, which has to do with digital activism. And some people had a submission that it's a pure waste of time because it's not directed towards the audience or the people you want to. And with regards to the people in the academia, like someone who is a young, maybe researcher or young lecturer, you know, there's all this fear about what I post on LinkedIn, on social media, on all these things, all this required. So we would need to get your input on digital activism and its impacts and its method, the ways it can be used. Because, you know, you talk about classroom activism, both of you are against that, but you support other form of activism. So let's take Dr. Adigun, why you help us to respond to that concern. Dr. Adigun, please go ahead with your comments, please. Very brief, we are coming to the end of the program. Dr. Adigun, please. Is he able to unmute himself, or he has dropped out? Let's confirm. Okay, he's no longer in. So please help us to address this concern on digital activism. Okay. Oh, he's trying to unmute himself. Okay, let me unmute him. Okay. You can now unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Thanks so much. Yes, I agree completely with Professor Aide's position that activism is broad and it cannot just be limited to opposing ideas to government. And what I just want to bring out is in respect of two things. First, activism itself may go against the people. Sincerely. That's right. And I'll give you a typical example. In a growing society where populism is the dangerous effect of populism, constitutionalism can be a way to check it. And a typical example was when the South African 1996 Constitution was about to be certified by the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Yes. People wanted death penalty, but the constitutional judges felt that it would be dangerous for the South African society. That might be applied more to South Africans of African ancestry as opposed to South African Indians or South African of European ancestry. Also, that is one area where you can have scholars or academics in the university who are likely to canvass from the perspective of constitutionalism against growing populism. So activism can also go against the people. It may not necessarily have to pander to the sentiment of the people. So that is one area that I intend to bring out. Then with respect to activism against government, yes, there are instances where activism, the nature of the subject you are dealing with, you cannot just help it. And I'll give you a typical example. When you are talking about rule of law, yes, if you are taking constitutional law and you are teaching basic constitutional concept, you are talking about rule of law. The time when there was EndSARS in Nigeria, there's no way you would discuss rule of law without going against government that probably doesn't have regard for people's rights. Then we're also teaching fundamental rights or human rights from constitutional perspective. There is no way you won't teach things that would definitely go against government interest. In fact, the nature of human rights, essentially historically, was to check the excesses of government, the excesses of the state. And so there is no way you will teach such courses without fundamentally going against government's position, even though I concede that activism is not necessarily limited to opposition against the governments alone. Now, coming about digitalism, yes, you know now that even the nature of academics is changing now. You discover that now we have podcasts. We use social media now, Twitter and the likes, to communicate academic ideas. So if now you want to use these social media platforms to teach maybe the rule of law, constitutionalism in contradiction to populism, definitely those platforms will be a way to oppose the population or to oppose the government. So that's just my take.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adekun. We are coming to the end of the program. Our speakers have been seated for almost 2 hours, and they're doing this voluntarily. They're not paid for this, and we appreciate them. They have been sharing from their wealth of knowledge, experience, as well as even engaging with the participants who are scholars across various disciplines across the globe from various countries. So we appreciate you. And as we come to this end, we based on the question on digital activism, as well as other things raised, we have speakers to give their last saying on this issue as we round up and give announcements on other webinars that will take place in the coming months. Thank you very much. Please go ahead, our guest of honor.
Okay.
Anyone can go, please. There's no one. Anyone can go first. And
well, let me just say that the concern about humanities, that it's only apparent when you look at the investment and the kind of patents and the market for technology-based research, for instance, or say for medicine, and the kinds of laboratory, the kind of equipment that you require for those kind of research. You know that the funds required for those scientific activities is not close to what we often need for research in the humanities. A lot of what we do in the humanities rely on brain power and some support from with computer analysis and so on and so forth, and then field work. But those other deep sciences, the natural sciences, require much greater investment, and they have greater market value if you're talking about the market. And so that's why it's often apparent that you know, more monies, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, in fact, go into those researches in relationship to the humanities. It's the humanities, it is the way it is. And I remember even in Nigeria, there was a time we are so concerned about building our technological capacity that in some schools, they were putting quota, 70% science, you know, for 30% humanities, until people started agitating that no, the humanities are just as needed as scientific knowledge and technology for a human society. So yes, that debate will continue, but I don't think, as Joanna said, we have more than anecdotal evidence to support any of those claims. In terms of digital technology, I think the point is really that we can't underrate digital activities. If you look at the Arab Spring, if you look at EndSARS, the conversation will start from those digital platforms. And then, because again, the speed with which mobilization can be done is such that it can be outside government reach, you know, and then people can then mobilize for fiscal activities before government is able to mobilize its resources to checkmate them. So yes, if you look at Arab Spring, you look at EndSARS, you know, digital mobilization is not something you can take for granted. And that is why the Nigerian government went as far as suspending Twitter. So I don't think it's not it's important at all. Then when you also talk about security, digital technology has become very critical. Remember in certain parts of the North, they had no answer to banditry, they had no answer to kidnapping until they suddenly realized that unless you cut off mobile communication, that will make it impossible for them to reach people by phone, by WhatsApp, or through those technologies. There's no way you're going to control banditry. So once that communication facilities was cut off, the bandits were literally going to home begging to exchange those who were kidnapped for food. So you can see how important and there's a whole study going on concerning the role of social media in security in Africa. I think some of our colleagues at the University of Birmingham Jonathan Fisher and I think Chisman are doing quite a number of things in that area in Nigeria. So yes, we should not undervalue or underestimate the importance of digital activism.
Thank you. Dr. Juan, please.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know that I can see that it's 2 p.m., but I think Professor Ayede made a lot of good points. Digital activism, or in general, the opportunities of social platforms are very much a double-edged sword, and so they can lead to social mobilization against a tyrannical government, if you will, right, or against corruption, for instance. It can also, as we know now, in many countries, in any country really, it can create these echo chambers, and so people being, only in tune with what their social networks are saying. So that's a danger that I think is increasingly understood by many, and so I think that's a downside of of some of the social platforms, that you get exposed to people you know, or people who know people you know, and not necessarily to what I was mentioning earlier, to certain quote unquote academics as experts, but more to quote unquote people as activists, with or without necessarily any knowledge to back up their claims. But false information travels faster in some of these platforms. So that's the counterpoint to the optimism that to some extent we can have behind digital activism.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you. And I think we need to give a round of applause. You can drop in the chat to appreciate Professor Juan, Dr. Juan, and Professor Emmanuel Ayede. And we're happy to always have you around us. We researchers, people who have interest in Africa. So we're not people of African descent across the globe. And we have a monthly webinar, and I'm going to just share with everyone the ones that are coming soon. We have in April, we're going to have in March, we're having a special session devoted to the question, who is an African? And this has been phrased as a form of a series of lecture in which we're going to have people who are scholars from Africa and also in the diaspora who have a first-hand knowledge about some of these nations and controversial issues or whatever. But we are focusing first of all on identity. Who is an African? What makes someone an African? And even the diaspora, if we're born in diaspora or not. So we're going to have a series of lectures. We have a set of questions and more there for the presenters. And the first, what we call the Pan-African conversation, is going to be held in March. And we have speaker from Tanzania, Dr. Olivia Khadija will be speaking representing Algeria. And we have Stephen Ayofa representing Nigeria. So that's the first edition, which is going to be in March. And then we're going to have a break in April. We're going to have a discussion on LGBTQ, Africans and stereotypes. This has been an issue that we have speakers who are coming on board. Dr. Jonathan, Dr. Anima, who is involved in publications and write-ups and on sexuality and LGBTQ in Africa. We have Shaka Ilop taking a look at the influence in the sports and this gender change. And we have Rennie Owens, and she will be speaking for looking at the Francophone countries and the impact. And then we have our brother Mukili to help in translating from French to English in order to be able to cover that. And I think the second, I need to include that so that we can include it in our diary. The second Pan-African conversation is taking place in May, which we have Dr. Teferi representing Ethiopia, and Dr. Benjamin, Irene Seme, Lesotho. We have Julius representing DRC Congo, and Dr. Lamine Sall representing Senegal. And we hope we'll be happy to have this conversation, and we appreciate your presence. You can be part of us. We continue part of this, what we have started here continues in the chat room, and people take a look at publications and other works and dig out other things for people who want to take this further towards having publication. So we appreciate your time. Special thanks to our speakers, special thanks to our participant team, those working underneath. You know, we have the first time we are invaded by bugs and also intruders, and we're happy that our team were able to handle that, and we appreciate everyone. And we hope that we'll see you next month, and wish you all the best in your career and other forms of activism you may be involved with. All the best. Thank you very much, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.